Brett Hudson.
Thank you, Mr Chair. It's a pleasure to rise and speak on this Christian Churches New Zealand Property Trust Board Empowering Bill. On this part one, Sarah, as my colleague has mentioned, under clause 3, the interpretation, as we see here, a core part, if you will, of this bill is the definition of property. And what we're doing here is we're simply defining this as meaning every type of property, and that will include not only every type of estate and interest in property, but also money, and all land registered in the name of the old board under the Land Transfer Act 1952. And that really comes to the heart of why we are having this legislation, Mr Chair. Well, the challenge that we now are faced with in a world which is so many decades after the initial trust and powers were put in place is one where originally the value and assets of the trust were all in property, and it was thought that that is the only real value that could be used of those assets, that it was all about providing property and facilities for the works they do. They now find themselves, some many decades later, having to face challenges in today's world, where if you've got some property, some buildings, some facilities somewhere, that may be all well and good and that they have a monetary value, but if you can't actually realise that monetary value, that monetary asset in some way, one can find themselves constrained from actually delivering the services to their constituents that the trust actually existed for in the first place. So with this interpretation, we will make it clear that property, for the purposes of this legislation, is any form of property in the name of the trust. By doing so, as the other provisions which we will get to will permit, it will mean that no longer will property have to be physical real estate or buildings, and therefore the trust will have the power to change one asset to another form of asset. So, for instance, they could sell property and gain a cash asset. Now, as we know on this side of the House, that's a very powerful ability, because this government, in its forward-thinking views, took the same approach into the last election through the mixed ownership model and said it is better for New Zealand, in some instances, to convert a physical property asset into a cash asset and then use that cash for things that are more meaningful for New Zealanders today and into the future, through the Future Investment Fund. One that's seeing schools built, hospitals built, ultra-fast broadband, rural broadband initiative, Mr Chair. What we saw was, if you simply limited property to physical property and plant and machinery in the case of those particular mixed ownership models, then you constrain choices, you can constrain the services and good you can do. So by taking such a broad definition of property, what we are permitting and enabling in this legislation is that the new trust will be in a position to make decisions today and into the future that will permit it to deliver the best possible outcomes and services to its constituents. We are actually empowering a new trust to be relevant today and into the future. Now, along with this, in clause 4, we're also making it clear, to help give effect to this, that the purpose of this enabling legislation is to transfer all of the existing property interests, powers and indeed the obligations of the old board, dissolve that board and repeal the old Property Act. So what we're basically saying is anything that was held by that trust will now come under the auspices and authority and power of the new trust, along with any associated obligations. And will dissolve the old legislation. Now, one point I would make here, because I think it is relevant to the idea of repealing the old Act and indeed of dissolving the old board, is the committee questioned officials as we went through consideration of this bill and asked, if we've come to a point where an old legislation is no longer valid, how do we ensure that the new legislation doesn't suffer the same fate at some point in the future? Why don't we just use general law, general trust law, to actually manage and incorporate this new trust in? And why don't we have a sunset clause so that this particular empowering bill would just cease after a period of time, and the new trust, the Christian Churches New Zealand Property Trust Board, would just be completely under the auspices of the Charitable Trust Act? Unfortunately, we didn't really get the answers we were seeking from that. But I think it was a very valid question for the committee to ask, and showing that we are taking a forward look.